In a year filled with world-changing events, many might have missed the first anniversary of the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan. And while from an outside perspective, the news from that country seems pretty dire, some people are already venturing into post-occupation Afghanistan as tourists, one of whom, former aid worker and media consultant Jeff Rigsby, is kind enough to join me now from Dubai. So thank you for speaking, Jeff. I will not be one of those people that asks you, why would you want to go to Afghanistan? Because I am very well aware of what a historic, culturally significant and beautiful country it is. But I am interested to know what led you to conclude less than a year after the collapse of the former government that traveling there as a tourist was a viable option.
Well, I guess I should add a couple of things just for context. A lot of people have asked me whether it's possible or feasible to travel in Afghanistan as a tourist, and I think it's kind of hard to answer that question without taking a few other things into consideration. It is not an easy place to travel, absolutely. And two of the things that made it possible for me were, first of all, the fact that I had lived in Afghanistan and I knew some people who were there. Sometimes traveled with them, although sometimes I was traveling solo. And I speak some Persian as well, because I did live there for a few years and was able to study some of the language. Persian is basically Dari, or Dari is the Afghan dialect of Persian. I think anybody who decides to travel in Afghanistan without having any contacts in the country and without speaking either of the major languages there would probably have some serious problems traveling outside of Kabul. And that's not because there are any official restrictions on travel. One of the first things I found, and this was actually a little bit frustrating after I arrived in Kabul, was that I couldn't get in touch with any government agency that would give me any sort of official permission or a letter authorizing me to travel around the country. I went to Afghan Tour, which is the official tourism promotion agency, and they're part of the Ministry of Information and Culture. And I said, I think it's going to be a little bit difficult, to travel in rural areas because tourism is kind of a surprising thing at this point, and people are going to be suspicious. Could you give me some kind of letter of authorization? And the people at Afghan Tour said, no, you don't need to do that. All you need to do is show people your visa, and that's all that's required. Which wasn't really the answer that I was hoping for, because even if it's technically true, you don't necessarily expect everyone in the country to understand that it's true. So what I was expecting to happen actually did happen. I was arrested 3 times during the 7 weeks that I was there. Never in a really intimidating or I don't want to say in a serious way. Let's put it that way. I was held up for several hours by people who didn't understand that a visitor visa by itself is enough to authorize you to travel around. So this is something that you would have to expect. And if you travel with Afghan friends or colleagues, ex-colleagues in my case, that may make it easier, but it can also cause problems for them. So in that respect, the country is, you could say, maybe not really ready for tourism, especially not, I would say, mass tourism. People have to have some experience with the country before they're going to feel comfortable traveling there. And you have to be willing to put up with a good deal of inconvenience. I knew that was going to come when I went, and so I factored it all in. But it was a very good experience.
Yeah, I think definitely what anyone listening should probably be clear on is that if they want to try and do what you did, they should definitely do their due diligence rather than just showing up at the border or at the airport or something. Which doesn't. I'm not saying that's not something that you did. That you didn't do your due diligence. I was a little bit surprised.
There were a couple of Western tourists who arrived earlier in the summer, like just before I did. I'm not going to name them. One British and one Australian, who were getting a little bit of attention on social media. These were very young white guys, I have to say, who I don't think had a whole lot of background or previous knowledge of Afghanistan, and were posting these very positive sort of vlogs and tweets about their experiences traveling around. I don't understand how that works. I mean, it's very clear to me that they must have had some kind of connection in country with people who wanted to present a positive image of the new government. And so they got a certain amount of criticism on social media for that. I have no idea who those people are, but whatever they did, they must have had some sort of preparation before they arrived. So beware, and don't just assume that you can show up.
definitely. So yeah, having made clear that this trip was purely recreational, based on the time where you had previously lived there, like, what was the biggest difference when you arrived? Was it immediately noticeable things were radically different?
Well, I arrived in the middle of Eid, what they call the Lesser Eid, Eid al-Qurban, or Eid al-Adha. So it was a public holiday which lasted several days, and in a way that made it a little harder for me to see immediately what had changed and what hadn't changed. One of the things that I had read about Kabul immediately after the Taliban takeover is that there was almost no traffic, and that the air pollution had disappeared because people were staying indoors, and then maybe later because people didn't have money for fuel. So the streets were definitely very quiet when I arrived, and I couldn't tell whether this was something that was a permanent change or if it was just a result of the holiday. After I had spent a few days there, and once Eid was over, um, I guess I could say my not my immediate reaction, but my reaction to let's say normal life in Afghanistan, not life in the middle of a holiday, was that the changes were less obvious than you might expect. There is still a lot of traffic. The air pollution is very bad when people are not staying home for the festival. The number of Taliban that you see on the street is much smaller than I'd expected. I had read that there were a lot immediately after the takeover in August. I talked to a few people who said that they seemed to disappear from Kabul in the autumn or maybe the winter. I'd heard different stories, but maybe around October, November, December, the number of soldiers, I guess you could call them, the number of Taliban fighters who were on the street diminished really dramatically. And nowadays you tend to see them mostly at checkpoints. You occasionally see individual Talibans walking in the street, but it's not very common. So that's you could say that's a change that I didn't see, even though I was expecting to see it. I was also expecting to see a big change in the way that people were dressed. And although there was a change, it wasn't quite as dramatic as maybe I had been thinking. I think maybe some of your viewers are aware that back in May of this year, the new government agency that is supposed to enforce things like dress codes, which is called the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, issued an order saying that all women had to cover their faces. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a full burqa, which goes over your head like a hood. It can mean something like a scarf or even a COVID mask would comply with the rules. So I was a little surprised to find that in central Kabul, which of course is a little bit more of a liberal area, the majority of women are not obeying the rules. If you travel a little bit further outside to the suburbs, you'll find that there are more people complying, more women complying. But it's still not universal. So the thing that struck me, again, was not so much the change as the absence of change. There are new rules for things like clothing, not just for women, but for men as well. But they don't seem to be very well enforced. There's a fear that they could be enforced at any time if you happen to run into one of the people who is in charge of administering these rules. But it doesn't seem to happen very often. So the immediate visible changes were not so obvious.
Is that evidence, do you think, that the Taliban has softened since the last time they were in power? Because they certainly want to present that that impression, it would seem.
I gave this some thought because I don't think that Afghans themselves know exactly why you could say the presence of the state is so limited, or has become so limited after the first few months when the Taliban arrived in Kabul. What I thought at first was that it might actually be something rather negative. You could say that it's a good thing that these rules for women's clothing are not being enforced, but it might actually reflect the fact that the Taliban don't have the capacity or the enforcement ability, just because they don't have enough personnel to do basic law enforcement of any kind, which in the long term would not be a good thing, because it doesn't just apply to what women and men are required to wear. It applies to things like ordinary crime control. That is one possibility. I think another, which maybe nobody has discussed, and I don't know whether Afghans would agree with me on this or not. You have to keep in mind that immediately after the Taliban took over, the only public protests that Afghans participated in were protests by women against the Taliban and against the rules that they wanted to impose on women. In, I think, mainly September and October of last year, but then a little more recently, a few weeks ago, there was some renewed street protests, but mainly in the autumn of last year. There were protests in every major city in Afghanistan, with women going out into the street and demanding the freedom to go to school, the freedom to wear what they wanted. The Taliban attacked the protests, beat up journalists who were trying to cover the women, sometimes beat the women themselves. And they never gave any indication that they would exceed any of those demands. But I can't help wondering if maybe their unwillingness to be too strict about dress codes might have something to do with their fear of more protests by women. If that were true, it would be a good thing. It suggests that protest actually works, but it's hard to say because the Taliban are a totally opaque organization.
So it sounds like, based on that answer, that, and it sounds like maybe you don't have an answer, is the level of control over the whole country that the Taliban has. Did it seem that there were parts of it that they didn't control? Or?
Well, the one province that I think people are concerned about is Panjshir, because that's where the opposition to the Taliban is strongest. I didn't go to Panjshir. That is the one province in Afghanistan where tourists are required to get a special letter of permission from the Interior Ministry. I didn't want to do that because I'd been to Panjshir already. I was actually more interested in traveling to some other parts of the country that were unsafe during the war, but relatively safe now. My sense is that the organized opposition, the rebel groups that people sometimes talk about overseas, are actually not very strong. So even if the Taliban itself is not the strongest organization, it doesn't seem as if there's an organized threat or an effective organized threat from any of these insurgent movements. But it's very difficult to tell. I was actually surprised, I have to say, by how easy it has been for journalists. And again, I'm not a journalist. This is what I've heard from people who do work in journalism. It's actually been fairly easy for them to travel even to areas where insurgents have been operating. You may have seen the Times of London had a story a few months ago about the situation in Balkhab, which is a district up in the north where there had been a rebellion by a local Islamic leader, which I think lasted only a few days. The reporter who covered that was able to go there with no interference, which I found very surprising. And again, it's hard to say. I'm sure it doesn't mean that the Taliban are a liberal organization. What it means is that they don't actually have very effective control over a lot of things. So whether that will be positive or negative in the long run, it's a little bit hard to tell. I will say this, I think in general, the security situation is good in most parts of the country. It's safe to drive at night in rural areas, which wasn't true before. There are certainly some areas where the Taliban are spread very thin. I had a very short visit to Nuristan province, which is maybe the remotest part of the country. And I was told that the Taliban were actually not allowed to go anywhere in the province except on the road to the capital. The local people treated them the same way they treated the previous government. They said they wanted to be left alone. That's a little bit of an exceptional situation. But in general, I think Afghanistan is a country where people in rural areas have always had to rely on themselves and have tried to avoid the attention of the state as much as possible. So it may be sustainable in the long run, it may not.
Is that perhaps why, things appeared to be pretty much functional, that people, especially as you say, in rural areas, have always had to rely on themselves, and so they're just continuing to do that regardless of who the government is?
I think that's true. I mean, the first point that you have to make is that there's been a huge drop in living standards because the money that was coming in that was connected to the war effort and connected to the presence of foreign troops and aid agencies and so on, most of that has been cut off. There's actually more humanitarian activity in the rural areas than there used to be because organizations like the World Food Program are able to travel to remote areas, which used to be insecure. But a huge percentage of the population now is dependent on food aid. So certainly there's been a very heavy blow to the economy. I think there may be a little bit of a tendency to exaggerate that on the part of some people who say that Afghanistan is on the verge of starvation or something along those lines. The situation is pretty bad, but it's not quite that bad, and I think it's a mistake to overstate the point. The other point that I guess I would make is that the war in Afghanistan, and I realized this very early because the first job I had there, this was more than 10 years ago, was for a military contractor that was supplying equipment to the U.S. Air Force. We had to bring in some tent heaters, basically just for remote outposts and small bases that had to be flown into Kabul and then shipped into the countryside. And I found out that the Afghan company that I was working for actually had to pay a fee to the Taliban to get the equipment safely from Kabul to these dangerous areas, because the security on the roads was so bad that convoys would be attacked unless they paid protection money. And again, this was more than 10 years ago. And when I think back to that now, I think this actually explains a lot about what has happened in the past year. What the civil war that was going on was a very strange kind of civil war, where actually both sides were being funded from overseas. That's been true of a lot of previous eras in Afghan history. But this time, both sides of the civil war were being funded by the same people. They were both being funded by the Americans. When the Americans left, the Afghan government lost all of its support, or lost a great deal of money that was coming in. But the Taliban also lost one of their major sources of income, which was protection money that was charged on the same type of contracting activity that the Afghan government itself was relying on. So when the Americans left, in a way, you could say the plug got pulled on both sides. There's no money coming in and no weapons coming in on either side to encourage more fighting. And that's part of the reason I think that these predictions of a new civil war or more disorder haven't happened. Not only are people tired of fighting, but they're not being paid to fight.
Can you maybe expand on, like, saying that the Taliban were receiving funding? I mean, do you mean that in any kind of active sense, or purely in what you outlined? Just
well, the example that I gave.
Yeah.
The example that I gave was true for basically all commercial activity. If any kind of valuable cargo was moving through an area that was under Taliban influence, the truck drivers would have to pay a certain percentage of value to the Taliban itself to make sure that they wouldn't be attacked. So it's a little bit of a strange situation. In my case, for example, I'm sure the American Air Force knew that the Taliban were getting a certain amount of money from the contract, but they decided that it was better to get the equipment, even if it meant that the Taliban would take off a certain percentage. But then the Taliban had made the same decision. They said, should we take this money and let the Americans get their equipment, or should we attack the convoy? They decided to take the money. So both sides thought that it was in their interests to have this sort of payoff system continue. But in the end, it was the Taliban that was right and the Americans who were wrong, because they did win with money that was partly, not entirely, put into the country by the United States and its allies.
That is a very bizarre situation.
It's not the first time. It's definitely not the first time in Afghan history that civil wars have involved outside powers funding one side or the other. The first Anglo-Afghan war happened because the British government decided that the Emir of Afghanistan was too friendly to Russia. So they gave guns and money to another guy who they thought would be more sympathetic to the British side. And in a way, you could say that set the pattern for the next 200 years. There's always been this belief among other countries that Afghanistan is a very important place and they can gain some advantage by supporting one faction or one side. But it never seems to work out. And at the moment, it doesn't seem like anybody wants to do that anymore, which is a very good thing.
So when you say that the humanitarian situation, although bad, is probably not quite as desperate as is made out to be in the media, how do you mean? Like, as we mentioned, are people just supporting themselves to however they can, or?
Well, people are also receiving a lot of humanitarian aid. I think a majority of the population is getting food aid of some kind. But it's very important to remember that when organizations like the World Food Program talk about a danger of famine, what they're talking about is a danger that will come to pass if the aid is not delivered. If you look at other countries in the world, for example, Ethiopia, where there's an actual very serious famine going on in the north right now, it's taking place because the north has been cut off from humanitarian relief. The Ethiopian government is basically blockading food supplies to that region of the country because they're trying to break rebellion against them. That's not happening in Afghanistan now. The aid agencies can reach almost every part of the country. They can actually reach those areas more easily than they can in the past. So there's certainly a concern that maybe not enough money will be available to give the agencies the funding that they need. But the access is actually there. I heard an interesting story from an Afghan friend of mine who he actually runs an NGO in Nuristan, the province that I mentioned earlier, which is very remote and inaccessible. He said that up until last year, there were about 4,000 families from Nuristan who were living in some slum district of Kabul in very bad conditions and almost completely dependent on relief from the World Food Program. As of now, he says about 3,000 of those families have gone back to Nuristan. And the reason they've gone back is that the World Food Program didn't used to operate there. But now they do. So if they want to get their relief, they can get it in their home villages. They don't have to go to Kabul and get it there. So the improvement in security, I think, should rule out any actual famine taking place. But that doesn't change the fact that the situation is very bad. People are experiencing a lot of hardship.
And we mentioned just before we started that you work in agriculture, or you have an agricultural business. Based on that, I don't know how much like farmland you actually manage to see, but is the agricultural system reconstituting itself? And
well, I didn't do a whole lot of research on agriculture when I was there. It was interesting to look at different provinces and see what their various strengths are. But I did have one very interesting experience. I went to Paktia province, which is right on the Pakistani border. And in fact, I was able to go all the way up to the fence that marks the Durand line. So you can actually look through the fence and see the Pakistani flag on the other side. But that border area is in a district called Zazi, which I had read about actually just on Twitter, not because anybody I knew happened to be from that area, but I'd seen something on Twitter a few months after the Taliban took over. An Afghan I was following, whose family is from that area, had gone back to visit because it had been a very dangerous area. I mean, going to the Pakistani border was just not something you could do before. And he went back to see what was going on, and he found that everybody was growing cannabis. Like the entire district was growing nothing but marijuana, and that the local government had actually given a fatwa, a religious authorization for the farmers to do this. So I was curious to see what the situation was, and when I got there, I found everybody was growing corn and beans and potatoes. So I asked around, and I guess this is not too surprising. The Taliban had ordered everybody to stop growing drugs. So their living standard is much lower now than it was before, because they'd been benefiting from this opportunity to grow a very profitable crop, and then the Taliban had ordered them not to do it. I don't know what's happening with opium, because that tends to be down in Helmand in the south, where I didn't travel on this trip. But they have said that they're going to ban opium production as well, which it's hard to see how they can do that, because many parts of the country are really dependent on opium production. I would have liked to go to a place like Helmand and see if the rules are being enforced there as strictly as they are in Paktia, because if they are, it's going to cause a lot of hardship.
I mean, just in terms of like going back to focusing on the fact that you were a tourist at the time, like how would you compare just being there in comparison to I don't know if you've been like, I'm assuming you've probably been to other countries that are quite well visited. Like in comparison to that, how secure did you feel?
I think that the security situation is fairly good. Now, I have to say I left Afghanistan in 2014. That was the last year that I worked there. And I always felt at the time that Kabul was a pretty safe city. There was not a whole lot of street crime, although sometimes foreigners would get kidnapped for ransom. Towards the end of the last government, the situation with violent crime and gang offenses started to get very bad. People told me that the Taliban had improved the situation a lot and made it more secure. Personally, that's how I felt. I think there are some urban neighborhoods in Kabul that are not so safe, maybe because the Taliban don't have good relations with the people who live there. But I think when you're in the countryside, it's a different situation. I mean, you don't particularly have to worry about violent crime in a village, but you do have to worry, especially when you're traveling, that local officials or local Taliban are not going to understand why you're there. That's the main concern, not so much physical insecurity.
And so, what were your interactions when you did have them with members of the Taliban?
In general, I would say, with very few exceptions, the Taliban that I had to interact with were very polite. They were polite even when they arrested me. So that's maybe not as positive as it could be. The first two times that I ran into trouble was at a checkpoint, or they were at checkpoints. I got pulled in at one point when I was coming back from Paktia to Kabul, and it was a fairly large sort of military installation, and the representative of the GDI, which is Taliban intelligence, brought me in and said, we have to call headquarters and make sure that this is all right. And we got tea, we got mangoes, we got bananas. They were very polite, but we couldn't leave for a few hours because they had to call the provincial capital. The provincial capital had to call Kabul, and then the message had to come back that, yes, it's all right for tourists to travel around. It was just a very unfamiliar situation for them. So they were doing what they thought they had to do. And then the second time was kind of similar, although that was a little bit worse because I was in a shared taxi going out of Mazar-e-Sharif to try to get to the next province. And I found myself holding up all the other people in the taxi, which was very bad. So eventually I told them all to leave. And then once they did get the call and they said that I could go, I didn't have a ride. So I ended up having to stay there for quite a while until a carload of intelligence people who were going the same way happened to come by. And so I got a ride with them. That was a little bit of a strange experience. But again,
So you
very polite people.
carpooled with the Taliban intelligence.
I was not allowed to take a lift in a private car. They had to have me go with one of their own groups of people when a car happened to come along that was full of intelligence officers. So that took a while for, it took a certain amount of waiting. But it was a unique experience, I'll say that.
Yeah. Do you think that they were more like concerned with making sure nothing happened to you or keeping an eye on you?
It's probably a little bit of both. I mean, I think they're like anybody else who works for bureaucracy. They're concerned about doing the wrong thing and having to explain that to their superiors. The third time that I was held up was actually when I was on my way to Nuristan. I had stopped for a little while with Afghan friends of mine in a town called Asadabad, which is the capital of Kunar province, very close to the Pakistani border. And we were getting ready to drive on. And we were in a restaurant, and some people came in from the Interior Ministry and took us in. This was the first time that it wasn't at a checkpoint. It was actually people coming and detaining us while we were in a public place. And again, we had to wait for a few hours until they cleared things. But the head of the Interior Ministry for that province made a really good point. He said that Daesh, ISIS, is active in this area, and what's going to happen to me if Daesh kidnaps you? Which is a fair point, but I think the issue that the Afghan government has to deal with, the issue the Taliban have to deal with, is that there are no clear rules for tourists to travel. The guy in Asadabad said that I should have reported to him before I decided to move on to Nuristan. But as far as I can tell, there was no requirement for us to do that. At least we were told in Kabul we didn't have to. So I think they need to work a little bit on clarifying what their procedures are and maybe providing some kind of support letter to people who do want to travel. That might make things smoother.
When
People
you
have not
say,
been hostile. They've been trying to do their jobs.
When you say, or when they said that ISIS was active in a certain area, I mean, what do you think that actually fundamentally means?
Well, I mean, there certainly is an ISIS presence in eastern Afghanistan near the Pakistani border. I don't think it's as strong as it was a year ago, mainly because the Taliban have killed a lot of those people. There was a report by Human Rights Watch this past summer, about a canal outside of Jalalabad where they found more than 100 bodies, which were people suspected of having links to ISIS. And when Human Rights Watch talked to the villagers in that area, they said that people had been dumped there over a period of months, beginning at the time when the Taliban arrived. So the Taliban do seem to have fairly good intelligence, and I'm not endorsing those types of methods, obviously, but they seem to know who they think they need to deal with. And what I've been told by people who live in eastern Afghanistan is that the ISIS threat is not as severe as it was a year ago. But that could change.
And just simply the fact that you worked for the Americans, like, I mean, I don't know if you would want to put it this way, but like for the American occupation, did that, I mean, come up at all as any kind of issue or sticking point with anyone?
Not for me. I mean, it has certainly come up for Afghans. I mean, people who worked with the previous government and who have skills that they want to offer, whether it's in engineering or any kind of technical field, are finding that it's really hard to get jobs with the new government, even though the new government has very limited technical expertise. There's a lot of resistance to hiring people who worked for the previous regime. As a tourist, I didn't encounter that at all. I got a little bit of negative comment from friends of mine who said the Americans shouldn't have left, but that's a different story. And of course, it wasn't the Taliban who were saying that.
I mean, I guess veering back to a conversation about tourism, what were the highlights for you?
The highlights.
Areas, experiences.
I think Nuristan was my personal highlight. Nuristan and the Pech Valley of Kunar, which is the road that you have to take to get there. That's a very dramatic area, and it's been off limits for a long time. The Pech Valley was one of the areas of heaviest fighting, not in recent years, but let's say in the first half of the war. The Americans did a lot of fighting in that area, and you drive past all of these abandoned American bases as you go up the mountains. I think in the last decade or so there hasn't been very much combat, so it's been a relatively peaceful area. But it's different from the rest of Afghanistan. It's very high up, it's mountainous, it's forested. I mean, there are lots of mountains in Afghanistan, but usually there's nothing growing on them. This is a very heavily wooded area and very scenic, but not easy to get to. I was lucky that I went to Nuristan the day that I did. If I'd gone about a day later, I think I would have been stuck because that's when the flooding began. The floods in Afghanistan have not been nearly as serious as they were in Pakistan, but they were bad enough that as we were coming back from Jalalabad to Kabul, we actually had to make a detour because the highway was flooded out. So if we'd stayed one day longer in Nuristan, I think we would have been stuck there as well. It is a scenic area. It probably has more tourism potential than many other parts of the country, but it's even more difficult to get to than other areas. So it's adventure tourism, however you put it.
And what do you think generally would need to change for it to become a more accessible place to just more casual travelers or people who don't have the level of familiarity that you have?
Nuristan in particular has infrastructure problems. There's only one road that will take you to the capital, and we had to drive through a river because the bridge was washed out. There are other parts of the country that are much more, I guess you could say they're less challenging in that way. I think Herat is a city that anyone who goes to Afghanistan should visit. There's a lot to see there: historical monuments, mosques, and Herat is also a very pleasant city. I always say that if the Afghan government really wants to develop tourism, one thing that they need to do is to find a way to create some tourist itinerary that doesn't take people through Kabul. Because Kabul is maybe not the most impressive part of Afghanistan. If there was a way to visit Herat or to visit Mazar-e-Sharif without flying to the capital, I think that would probably attract quite a lot of people. It's going to be nothing more than an adventure destination for quite a while because the government has a lot to do that's probably a higher priority than making itself attractive to tourists. But I do think that it's worth visiting for people who understand a little bit about the background of the country and are willing to put up with a certain amount of inconvenience. You get what you pay for.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And it's a very cheap country to travel in, I will say that. It's not expensive at all. That's some compensation for the other difficulties, but yes, that's one thing that should be pointed out.
And what sense do you have, I guess, holistically of the direction Afghanistan is going in? Is it like incrementally working itself out, do you think?
That's difficult to say. I mean, the economy is, people sometimes say the economy is in free fall. I don't think it's in free fall. It was in free fall for the first few months, and now it's stabilized at a much lower level than it was before. People are trying to get their lives together. And in that sense, I don't see anything really dramatic changing. What everyone in Afghanistan wants to know, and Afghans don't know the answer to this question either, is when will the girls' high schools reopen, and when will the Taliban have some kind of normal relationship with other countries? Because those two things go together. And I find that even when I talk to Afghans who were very much opposed to the occupation and trying to be sympathetic to the Taliban and to the difficulties that they're facing, it's incredibly frustrating even for those people that there hasn't been any movement at all on the issue of girls' schools, because they know, and probably the Taliban also know, that there won't be any progress on Afghanistan's international relations until that happens. They'll continue to get relief aid. People will continue to not starve because they'll get free food. But for anything more positive than that to happen, there has to be some normalization of relations to other countries. And I think the issue of girls' education is an obstacle to that, which is probably not going to be overcome unless somehow the Taliban are able to break their own internal deadlock on that issue.
Well, given the apparently more pragmatic streak among some of them, is it possibly moving in the direction where this sort of this hoped for inclusive government that brings in more of the country's religious and ethnic minorities might possibly happen?
It's hard to say, just because, as I say, it's not a transparent organization. I think people's hopes for the reopening of girls' schools are maybe a little bit higher than their hopes for an ethnically inclusive government. Now, it is true that there are a few non-Pashtuns. There are some Tajiks, some Hazaras who are participating in the current government, but not very many. And I think when people talk about the idea of inclusivity, you have to take that, I think, with a grain of salt, because some of the people that you see on social media calling for the Taliban to be more inclusive, excuse me, some of those people are the ones who had power in the previous regime. What they want is power sharing. They want their own positions back, or they want positions for members of their families back. That's not necessarily something that's very desirable or very important. Now, if the current government can open itself up to more participation from other ethnic groups, not necessarily the people who were in charge last time around, that would be a very positive thing. But it's about asking people to give up power, which is not something people usually do voluntarily. So I don't know that I would necessarily be very optimistic about that. I think what people are hoping for is not necessarily that they will be inclusive, but just that they will try to do a better job. And even that is, I think, being disappointed to some extent.
So you mentioned that you briefly and unintentionally became Twitter famous while you were traveling. Can you explain what that was about? Because I think I might have seen it, but I didn't understand what the context was or anything.
I've never particularly used Twitter until I went to Afghanistan and decided that there were interesting things to tweet about. So at the time, I think I had 20 or 30 followers, and most of them were people that I knew personally. And I never tweeted anything. Sometimes I would retweet things. But I did start making observations that struck me as interesting. After I was there for maybe 5 days or so, it's embarrassing to say that because I ended up being there for a couple of months in the end. But after my 5th day, I couldn't stand it anymore. And I decided to do a very long tweet thread about everything that I had been thinking. And I wouldn't recommend that if it's your first trip, because what I was trying to do basically was to put some context based on my experience of having lived there before. So mainly I was just expressing the surprise that I'd mentioned earlier, that the presence of the Taliban in terms of law enforcement seems to be very thin, which could be a positive in some ways, but also makes you wonder about the future stability of the system. So it's what always happens with Twitter. A couple of famous people decided to retweet it, and so I got some attention from that. And after a while, I had a few hundred followers. Not famous at all by anybody's reasonable standards, but at least it gets a little bit of attention. I don't think I would necessarily agree with everything I said in those tweets after the first 5 days, but I wanted to do something that was sort of a fresh impression of the country. And I guess my most basic observation would still be the same as what I had said earlier. I think there are two narratives about Afghanistan that are very popular in the rest of the world. One is that the Taliban that Afghanistan has turned into a kind of North Korea, that it's a regime where every woman is wearing a burqa and people are whipped in the streets and so on. There are certainly a lot of abuses and arrests, killings that have taken place, but it's not really a good description of the feel that you get when you're in the country. Most people are not happy about the new government, but it's not palpably totalitarian in the way that people sometimes think. And then the other misconception, I think, is that Afghanistan is in the middle of a humanitarian catastrophe. That's not so much wrong as it is exaggerated. I mean, the situation is very bad, and the U.S. is not doing as much as it could to resolve it. But people are living normal lives there, not as comfortably or as easily as they did a year ago. So I think the country is maybe a little bit over dramatized in foreign media, you could say. I think that's partly because a lot of the journalists were there immediately after the Taliban takeover, when things were very bad and the population was terrified. There were huge numbers of Taliban wandering around in the street, and nobody knew what was going to happen. But then, as people told me, they sort of faded away, and people tried to get back to some version of normal life. They haven't always been allowed to do that. The Taliban can show up at any time and say you're not wearing the right clothes, or your company should not have women and men working in the same room. That happens, and it happens in a very arbitrary way, but maybe not quite in the way that some people are imagining it.
So a lot of attention, at least on Twitter, has been drawn to the fact that the monetary reserves of the former government remain frozen in the United States and they're not being unfrozen. How much is that a contributing factor to the difficulty that people are living through?
It is a contributing factor. I think it is probably a minor contributing factor, and I think this is a misconception that a lot of people have. The main reason that living standards in Afghanistan have collapsed over the past year is because the money that was being spent to support the war and to support, as you called it, the occupation, has been cut off. I mean, that was a very heavy blow to the economy. Some people say maybe 40% of Afghanistan's GDP consisted of money coming in from overseas. That's completely separate from the fact that a few $1 billion of central bank funds are frozen. Now, I talked to Afghan friends of mine who are doing business, and they say it is definitely an inconvenience that the banking system isn't working or not working in a normal way. But it's not a catastrophic inconvenience. Lots of businesses prefer to rely on Hawala, which is an Islamic system of money transfer that operates outside of the official banking system. So if you want to send money to your business partner or to a vendor or a client, you can do that using Hawala, and you don't have to use the formal banks. And in fact, a lot of Afghan business people don't particularly trust the banking system in the first place. You also have to remember only about 15% of Afghan families have a bank account. Now, some of the people in that 15% are friends of mine, people like ex-colleagues who have their salaries frozen in a bank account and can only take out a very small amount every week. That's a really serious problem, but it's not the cause of the humanitarian crisis. The humanitarian crisis is affecting people who were at the bottom of the ladder. These are not people who had bank accounts in the first place. I agree absolutely that the freezing of the funds is a problem and it needs to be reversed. I mean, the U.S. I think is working on some kind of negotiated agreement where there will be monitoring of how the funds are used after they're released to the central bank. But at the moment, I think there are lots of other factors that are contributing to lack of business confidence in Afghanistan, mainly the fact that nobody really knows what the new government is going to do. So it's one factor among many. I don't think it should be exaggerated as a contributing factor.
And in general, I assume this probably isn't the first country off the beaten track that you've visited. How would you say it compares?
I'm trying to think which other countries off the beaten track I visited. I mean, I've lived in Ethiopia for the last few years, which also a very poor country, but not until recently one that had security problems. I find now that Afghanistan is a much safer place to travel, at least in rural areas, than Ethiopia is. Afghanistan, at least during the war, it was kind of a strange place because it was an extremely poor country that was also having an enormous amount of money pumped into it. And I guess in a way you could say it's a little bit less abnormal now. It's more like other developing countries that I've traveled to. People are facing a great deal of hardship, but they're facing it under what you could call more normal circumstances. The economy isn't distorted by this huge influx of funds. And for people in Kabul, that's actually been very negative because Kabul was where a lot of the money was coming in. And so everyone you talk to is jobless. Not necessarily in a literal sense, but people are maybe living on the one member of their family who has a job of some kind. So yeah, I'm wandering off my topic here. I'm trying to think what other developing countries I've been to that would be comparably difficult.
Well, it sounds like that Afghanistan, in terms of security, in terms of safety, kind of ranks quite favorably.
I think it's relatively favorable in terms of your risk of being robbed or kidnapped or something like that. I don't know how stable that situation is, though. One of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about my first few weeks was, why has the crime rate dropped so much? The economy is in very bad shape. Lots of people are unemployed. Lots of people are having trouble feeding their families. The previous police and army were dissolved. The Taliban have replaced them, but the numbers on the street are not very large. And I think the answer varies from place to place. I stayed with a friend of mine in the suburban area of Kabul, which was primarily Pashtun, an area called Bagrami. He said Bagrami was very dangerous up until the time the Taliban arrived. But then when the Taliban did take over Kabul, they asked the local people who the criminals were, and then they killed them. So for the last year or so, it's been relatively safe. Now, there are other neighborhoods of Kabul where the Taliban have almost no public support. These are areas where the population is maybe from Panjshir or maybe Hazara, Shiite. These are ethnic groups that have always been very hostile to the Taliban. And there are some neighborhoods of Kabul where those are the groups that dominate. Some of those neighborhoods have continued to be pretty unsafe. And I think, I don't know this for sure, but I think it's because the Taliban haven't received a lot of cooperation from the local public in terms of being able to maintain public safety. But what you really have to wonder is how long is that going to last? They can't, I mean, no country has ever succeeded in eliminating crime just by killing people. It might work for a little while, but eventually they have to have a more normal system of law enforcement. And if they don't do that, it's hard to see that a country with as much hardship and poverty as Afghanistan has is going to remain a safe place to travel.
Well, it's a very fascinating insight to get in comparison with, you know, the fairly predictable narrative, which is not to say that it isn't true, as you say, as much as exaggerated.
I think
did you have any?
The other thing you have, sorry.
I was just going to say, if you had any, like, perhaps closing thoughts that you wanted to share.
I think the most important thing that outsiders can do is not to generalize too much about Afghanistan, because what you find is true in one part of the country may not be true in another. And that's one of the reasons that it's an interesting place to travel. There is a lot to see and there's a lot to experience. You have to be prepared to be very patient, and you do have to do a good deal of work beforehand. I don't know actually if there are any resources available for people who don't already have contacts or, let's say, friends inside Afghanistan. It would be a bit challenging to go there without that, but I think even if you did, you might be able to work things out in Kabul. But the key would be to be prepared. That's what I would say.
Well, as I said at the beginning, like, I am aware of what a fantastically historical and beautiful country Afghanistan is. So, I mean, I would like the opportunity to be able to visit one day, and based on what you've told me, maybe that will be possible sooner than I might have otherwise anticipated.
I hope so.
Just thank you very much for sharing these experiences while they're fresh in your memory.
Thank you.